This is the 9th video in the Divided Kingdom series, and we've been looking at the northern kingdom of Israel. In this video, we'll find out more about Assyria and examine the fall of Samaria in more detail. Just about the time Israel was entering the Promised Land, the Hittite Empire, to their far north, was already crumbling. That empire ended around 1180 BC, hundreds of years before David ever became king of a united Israel. Egypt had already seen its glory days too. They'd never build another pyramid again. Though still quite large and powerful, it was really no serious threat in the Promised Land. During the period of the Judges and all those heady days of David and King Solomon, Egypt was much too busy trying to maintain its own crumbling empire to bother much with Palestine. And then the Syrians in the immediate north were never strong enough by themselves to overpower a united Israel. Saul, David, and King Solomon gradually came to terms with the Phoenicians and the Philistines along the Mediterranean Sea coast by making them trading partners. And finally, there's Mesopotamia, where the world as we know it all began. When Israel was crossing the Jordan River to conquer Canaan land, Mesopotamia was still just a bunch of disjointed and warring factions consumed with their own problems and politics. Israel as a nation came into existence essentially in a vacuum. It grew and flourished, at least on the human level, between the 12th and 8th centuries, primarily because they didn't have anybody else to face that was bigger than themselves. There just really wasn't anyone around to seriously challenge them for possession of the Promised Land. They went around knocking over little city-states one after another until they'd carved out a territory for themselves. And once that initial conquest was over, Israel enjoyed over 500 years without serious threat of invasion. It was almost as if some invisible hand was holding the surrounding powers at bay. Unfortunately, Israel not only forgot the God who had delivered them from Egypt, they also forgot the terms of that contract they signed when they were entering the Promised Land. Remember, if you do this, then I'll do this. But if you do that, then I'm going to do this.
All these curses shall come upon you, and pursue you, and overtake you, till you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to keep his commandments and his statutes that he commanded you. They shall be a sign and a wonder against you and your offspring forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking everything. And he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. It shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. It also shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your herds or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. They shall besiege you in all your towns, until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land. And they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you.
One of the big consequences hanging over their heads for all those years was the promise that the Lord would bring a fierce and pitiless nation against them to remove them from the land if they were unfaithful. It's written in the contract. And as we have seen repeatedly with Solomon, Jeroboam, Baasha, Ahab, Jeroboam the second even, God doesn't always bring judgment immediately, but he always judges sin, and someone always pays eventually. The promises he makes, he keeps, but in his own timing. And eventually, inevitably, God imposed the terms of the contract on faithless Israel. It's not like this had been some big secret all along. Plenty of the prophets had warned of Yahweh's impending judgment. Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Isaiah, and other prophets with no name. They'd been warning Israel of the coming judgment for years. God not only told them what he was going to do, he even told them who he'd use to do it. Assyria.
The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. In that day the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river, with the king of Assyria.
The wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria.
The only real unanswered question was, when? The relative calm broke in 745 BC when Tiglath-Pileser III, also called Pul in Scripture in some places, assumed the throne of Assyria and began ruthlessly consolidating these warring factions. He soon extended control over Babylon to the south, the Medes to the east. He defeated all opposition in the north, and then he turned his attention to the west. Eventually, his empire controlled most of Asia Minor, Phoenicia, Syria, Egypt, and the northern kingdom of Israel. Other countries, like Judah, were paying extortion money just for the privilege of being nominally independent. For 2,500 years, the primary source of information about Assyria was the Bible. Very few other ancient manuscripts even mentioned this supposedly world-dominating power, and nowhere else was found anything about some king named Sennacherib. Historians scoffed. Critics snickered. They don't exist. It's just another stupid Bible story. And once again, the Bible is absolutely proven to be wrong. But in 1842, a Frenchman named Paul-Émile Botta stumbled across that great city. Nineveh, you know, the one that didn't exist. And in 1849, Sir Austin Henry Layard discovered the palace of the king skeptics swore never existed. Sennacherib's palace covered literally acres, and he found 71 rooms containing giant floor-to-ceiling alabaster bas-reliefs that confirmed the biblical description. Assyrians were cruel, destructive, intolerant of others, oppressive beyond belief, and a most formidable enemy. Assyria was essentially just one big giant violent killing machine whose national preoccupation was war. They loved it, they gloried in it, and they were exceptional at it. All of Assyrian life was centered around the military, and all the nobility class belonged to the military. Most of their cultural achievements, like the division of the circle into 360 degrees, the development of longitude and latitude for navigation, advances in mathematics and medicine, all were aimed at improving their military capability. The irony is that the military was not paid. They should have had a union. The soldiers relied solely upon whatever they could plunder from their victims, So understandably, all of the victims were thoroughly picked clean. Assyrians weren't good at international trade or diplomacy. They wanted something, they just took it. They didn't negotiate. Neighboring towns and countries were simply regarded as storehouses from which the Assyrians could extract tribute or plunder at will. People that lived there, too bad for them. If they couldn't be used, they were expendable. Assyrian soldiers were one of the first to utilize iron weapons. They fought ferociously, they were ruthlessly efficient, and while most of their adversaries were still organized along tribal or geographic lines, Assyria's disciplined units were organized by function, just like a modern army today. They developed specialized corps of infantry, artillery, cavalry, combat engineers, even snipers and marine units. And they employed these units together with great skill to support and complement each other. This is a fragment from Sennacherib's palace. And you can see on the left, there's infantry scaling the wall. Looks like they're using a ladder. And down below on the ground, you can see archers providing covering fire. If the fragment were bigger, we might see a siege tower rolling up behind the infantry with archers raining down arrows on the defenders. There might be an iron-tipped battering ram attacking the front gate. And at the same time, engineers would be tunneling underneath the wall. In addition to brute conquest and plunder, Assyrians added the calculated use of violence and intimidation. These were possibly the first terrorists. Coincidentally, they came from the Middle East. Go figure. Some reliefs found in the palace show Sennacherib standing in his war chariot watching the sacking of Lachish. Prisoners are being impaled on pointed spikes. Other prisoners are staked out on the ground, being slowly flayed alive. Women and children are driven away captive. Headless bodies floating down the river. One officer reported to his superior, "My officers put to the sword the inhabitants, young and old. They did not spare anybody. They hung their corpses from stakes, flayed their skins, and covered with them the walls of the town." Here's another peaceful scene depicting another king, King Assurbanipal, with his queen relaxing in their garden after a hard day at the office. They're eating, being fanned by servants, taking life easy while musicians entertain them. Probably didn't have cable. Only one thing could make this domestic scene even sweeter: the decapitated head of some conquered victim hanging in a tree in the garden. Yeah, these were the kind of people Yahweh created specifically to punish unfaithful Israel. Now you may be beginning to see why Jonah was reluctant to go preach to the Assyrians. God told him to go northeast to Nineveh, but he took off in the opposite direction, southwest to Joppa, and that's where he hopped the freighter headed for Spain. You see, Jonah lived during the reign of Jeroboam II, only 60 years before Assyria was going to swoop down and wipe them out. Jonah knew Israel had failed to live up to the contract that they had with God. He knew very well what God had promised if they didn't, and he knew that the Assyrians were going to be the instrument of that judgment. He'd seen what had happened to other nations Assyria had decided to wipe out, and who wouldn't rather see them get it than Israel? In earlier wars, Assyria followed the cruel but simple policy of genocide. They completely exterminated everybody they couldn't immediately use, stole everything they wanted, and just destroyed the rest. In later years, they modified this practice so that they could have their cake and eat it too. They developed this clever technique of deporting victims to various places within the Assyrian Empire, displacing the conquered population, and then replacing them with various foreigners imported from somewhere else. This way they could plunder a country, assure that the conquered people could never reorganize and revolt, but they could maintain a weak and disjointed population in place from which they could either extract annual tribute or come back again in a few years and do it all over again. This is what they did with Israel.
Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it.
King Hoshea had formed a secret alliance with Egypt under the false illusion they would protect him from Assyria when he stopped making those payments. He was wrong. Shalmaneser attacked Samaria in 724 BC, and Egypt didn't do anything about it. But Shalmaneser died before he could finish capturing Samaria. His successor was Sargon II. Sargon finished the job in 722 BC. Now, from the eternal perspective, it really didn't matter whether Hoshea paid his tribute or not. It also didn't matter whether the Assyrians thought they were coming to collect back taxes or not. The real reason was that God used the Assyrians to execute judgment on Israel for not paying him what was due him.
In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, and placed them in Halah, and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes.
The Assyrians were brutal. Unknown thousands were slaughtered outright in the taking of the city. Thousands more were deported to various places throughout the Assyrian kingdom, never to be heard from again. Estimates on the number of deportees range from 4 to 28,000, with absolutely no guesses how many actually arrived at the destinations. We're talking about a grueling 500 to 600 mile walk with women and children on minimal rations. I mean, it's not hard to imagine most of them dying along the way. Yet these few people from Samaria were about all that was left of a kingdom that had at one time numbered in the millions. The Assyrians did leave a few peasants back in Israel to tend the fields, and then they imported other foreigners to repopulate the area. And these groups intermarried and later become the despised Samaritans of Jesus' day. But at this point in time, the northern kingdom of Israel simply ceased to exist. Israel was completely assimilated into the Assyrian Empire, and in fact, when Assyria later attacked Judah, some of the attackers were Israelites. The writer of 2 Kings gives a long theological evaluation of the fall of the northern kingdom, attributing their demise directly to their unfaithfulness in keeping that covenant with Yahweh.
And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them,
"You shall not do this."
Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying,
Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets.
But they would not listen, but were stubborn as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. And they made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, and afflicted them, and gave them into the hand of plunderers, until he had cast them out of his sight. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord, and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day.
But what, you may ask, happened to the golden calves? Hosea provides us the answer.
The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Beth-aben. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests, those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow upon their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, "Cover us!" and to the hills, "Fall on us!" From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not the war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah?
When I please, I will discipline them, and nations shall be gathered against them when they are bound up for their double iniquity.
Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck. But I will put Ephraim to the yoke. Judah must plow, Jacob must harrow for himself. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love. Break up your fallow ground, for it is the time to seek the Lord, that he may come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed iniquity, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruit of lies, because you have trusted in your own way and in the multitude of your warriors. Therefore the tumult of war shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be destroyed, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel on the day of battle. Mothers were dashed in pieces with their children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great evil. At dawn the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off.
Okay, we finished the northern kingdom. In the next video, we're going to start over again at 930 BC and work our way through the kings of the southern kingdom, beginning with Solomon's son, Rehoboam. You might want to first read 1 Kings 11 through 15, just the parts about Rehoboam and his son Abijah, and 2 Chronicles 10 through 13. Okay, have a good day.